I remember the exact moment things stopped feeling normal, even though nothing obvious had happened yet. It was one of those evenings that looked harmless from the outside. Just my husband and his friends sitting around, laughing too loudly, passing comments that blurred the line between jokes and something else. I had been in that room so many times before, playing my role perfectly, smiling when expected, staying quiet when needed. But that night something shifted, and I felt it before I understood it. My husband barely looked at me when I walked in. That wasn't new. Lately, it felt like I had become part of the furniture in my own home, present, useful but unnoticed. He was busy telling a story, his friends hanging on every word, and I stood there for a second longer than necessary, waiting for him to acknowledge me. He didn't. So I moved like I always did, quietly, naturally, pretending it didn't bother me. But they noticed me. Not all at once. Not in a way that anyone could easily point out. It was slower than that. A glance that lingered just a second too long. Pause in conversation when I passed by. A shift in tone that made me feel like I had walked into the middle of something I wasn't supposed to hear. I told myself I was imagining it. That's what I always did when something felt uncomfortable. I softened it, reshaped it into something harmless. Then one of them made a joke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly bold on the surface. But it carried a weight underneath it that made the air feel heavier. The others laughed, but not in the usual carefree way. There was hesitation, like they were testing something, pushing a boundary just to see if it would hold. I felt it land. Even if my husband didn't react at all, that I should have left the room. That would have been the normal response. The expected one. But I didn't move. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, pretending to focus on something else while my mind tried to catch up with what I had just heard. Another comment followed. Slightly clearer this time. Still wrapped in humor. But the meaning underneath it wasn't hiding anymore. I could feel my heartbeat shift, not faster exactly, but heavier. Like each beat carried more awareness than before. And what unsettled me the most wasn't what they were saying. It was my own reaction to it. I wasn't offended. That realization came quietly, almost like a whisper I didn't want to acknowledge. I waited for the discomfort, for the anger, for the instinct to shut it down. But none of that came. Instead, there was something else, something I didn't want to name too quickly. Curiosity. I hated that word the moment it formed in my mind. I tried to push it away, to replace it with something safer, something more appropriate. But it stayed there, steady and undeniable. Because the truth was, it had been a long time since anyone had looked at me like that. Like I was more than just someone's wife, more than a background presence in a room full of louder voices. One of them looked directly at me then, not bothering to hide it anymore. There was no joke in his expression this time, no mask to make it seem harmless. It was clear, intentional, and it sent a strange kind of tension through me. Not fear. Not exactly. Something more complicated. I glanced at my husband, almost instinctively, waiting for him to notice, to say something, to pull the moment back into something normal. But he didn't. He just kept talking, laughing, completely detached from the shift happening right beside him. And that, more than anything else, made something inside me sink. Because in that moment it became painfully clear. He either didn't see it or he didn't care. The conversation behind me continued, but it had changed. The jokes were sharper now, more deliberate. Each one felt like a step closer to something unspoken but understood. And with every passing second it became harder to pretend I didn't know where it was leading. Then it happened. The comment that wasn't really a joke anymore. It was said casually, almost like it didn't matter, like it could be brushed off if needed. But the meaning was there, unmistakable and direct. They wanted to watch. Not in the literal sense they could deny later, but in a way that left no room for confusion if you chose to understand it. Silence followed, but not the empty kind. It was full, heavy, waiting. I felt every second of it stretch, my mind racing through the possible reactions I could have. I could laugh it off. I could walk away. I could call it out and end whatever this was immediately. All of those options were right there, clear and available. But I didn't take any of them. Instead, I stood there, completely still, aware of every pair of eyes in the room, even if they weren't all looking at me directly. And in that stillness, something shifted inside me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore, because beneath the shock, beneath the confusion, there was a thought forming, quiet but persistent. Why didn't I completely hate the idea? That question unsettled me more than anything they had said. It felt wrong just to think it, like I was already crossing a line without moving an inch. But it was there, undeniable, growing stronger the longer I stayed in that moment. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That thoughts were just thoughts. That curiosity didn't equal intention. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew something had already changed, because I understood what they meant. And worse than that, a part of me didn't want to walk away from it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because anything had actually happened, but because of how close it felt to happening. Every word, every look, every pause replayed in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. I kept trying to reshape it into something harmless, something I could dismiss by morning. But the more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that it hadn't been harmless at all. And what bothered me even more was that I hadn't stopped it, that I had stayed. I had listened. I had understood. That alone should have been enough to push me into anger or at least distance. Instead, I found myself analyzing it from every angle, not just what they meant, but what it meant about me. My husband acted like nothing had changed. The next morning, he moved through the house the same way he always did, detached, distracted, more focused on his phone than anything else around him. He didn't bring up the night before, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't even look at me long enough to notice that something was off. First, I waited for him to say something. I thought maybe he would mention it casually, laugh it off, or at least acknowledge that things had gotten strange. But he didn't. And slowly that silence started to feel heavier than the comments themselves. Because if he had noticed, his lack of reaction meant something. And if he hadn't noticed, that meant something worse. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. That I was overthinking everything. But then his friends started acting differently. Not all at once. Not in a way I could easily call out. It was subtle, almost careful. One of them lingered a little longer when he said goodbye. Another started texting my husband more often, but occasionally included me in the conversation in ways that felt unnecessary. And then there were the looks again, quieter this time, more controlled, but still there. It wasn't just in my head. That realization settled in slowly, like something I had been avoiding finally catching up to me. They weren't pretending anymore. Not completely. The jokes were still there, but now they felt like a cover rather than the main point. And the worst part? I didn't shut it down. I told myself I was just being polite. That ignoring it was easier than confronting it. That as long as I didn't respond directly, I wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Because silence can say a lot. Days passed, but the tension didn't disappear. It stretched instead, weaving itself into small moments. A casual gathering turned into something loaded with unspoken meaning. A simple conversation carried an edge that hadn't been there before. And I started noticing things about myself that I couldn't ignore anymore. I paid more attention to how I looked before they came over. Not intentionally, not in a way I could easily admit, but it happened. I became more aware of my tone, my posture, the way I moved through the room. It was subtle, but it was there. That awareness came with a quiet justification. I told myself it was natural. That anyone would react to being noticed after feeling invisible for so long. That it didn't mean I wanted anything to happen, it just meant I wasn't used to that kind of attention anymore. But that wasn't entirely true either. Because there was a moment, small, almost insignificant on the surface, that changed everything. We were all in the same room again, the atmosphere lighter than before but carrying the same undercurrent. My husband was there, physically present but mentally somewhere else, barely engaged in what was happening around him. And then one of his friends said something. This time it wasn't hidden behind humor. It was direct. Calm. Almost too calm. The kind of statement that doesn't need to be repeated because everyone hears it clearly the first time. The room didn't react right away. No laughter. No immediate response. Just a pause that felt intentional, like everyone was waiting to see what I would do. I felt it instantly. That pressure, that awareness, that shift where the moment stops belonging to everyone and starts belonging to you. I should have said something. Even a simple dismissal would have been enough. A small rejection to reset the tone, to put everything back where it belonged. But the words didn't come. Not because I couldn't find them, but because I hesitated. And that hesitation changed everything. It wasn't long. Just a few seconds. But it was enough. Enough for them to notice. Enough for the moment to settle into something real. My heart was beating harder now, not out of fear, but out of something I didn't want to fully understand. I could feel the weight of my own awareness pressing in, forcing me to confront the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was choosing not to stop it. I glanced at my husband again. almost out of habit, hoping, just for a second, that he would break the moment for me, that he would step in, say something, shift the attention away. But he didn't. He just sat there, completely unaware, or completely uninterested. And in that instant, something inside me settled into a decision I didn't say out loud, because I didn't walk away, that I didn't correct them, that I didn't pretend I didn't understand, that I just stayed exactly where I was, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become an answer. And somehow that felt louder than anything I could have said. Everything slowed down after that, not on the outside but inside me. The room still looked the same, the voices still moved around me, but I wasn't hearing things the way I used to. Every word felt deliberate now, every pause filled with meaning that didn't need to be explained anymore. No one was pretending. That was the first thing I fully understood. Whatever line had existed before, it was gone. Not dramatically, not with some obvious moment of crossing, but quietly, in the space I had left open. And now we were all standing on the same side of it, whether we admitted it or not. I became aware of how still I was. Not frozen, not uncomfortable, just steady. Surprised me. I had expected panic, guilt, something loud enough to push me out of the moment. But instead, there was this strange calm settling in, like I had already accepted something without realizing it. One of them shifted slightly closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to notice. It wasn't accidental. Nothing about this felt accidental anymore. I could feel their focus without even looking directly at them. Waiting. Not forcing. Not rushing. Just waiting. For me. That realization should have scared me. Maybe it did, somewhere deeper than I wanted to look. But on the surface, what I felt was different. It was control, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not in my marriage, not in my own space, not even in how I was seen. For once, the moment depended on me. And that changed everything. I let my gaze move, slow and deliberate, not avoiding them anymore. The second I did, the tension sharpened. It wasn't hidden now. It was shared, understood without a single word being said. I knew exactly what they wanted. But more importantly, I knew exactly what I was allowing. That was the part one couldn't escape. Because nothing had technically happened yet. There was still space to step back, to close the door I had quietly opened. But I didn't move toward that option. I stayed right where I was, letting the moment build instead of breaking it. And in doing that, I crossed something that had nothing to do with them. It was internal. A shift in how I saw myself. I wasn't just the ignored wife standing in the background anymore. I wasn't waiting for my husband to notice me, to validate me, to bring me back into focus. That need, it felt distant all of a sudden. Because I was already being seen. The silence stretched again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full. Almost heavy with anticipation. No one rushed to fill it. No one needed to. The understanding between us had replaced the need for conversation. I could feel my heartbeat now, stronger, more present, echoing in a way that made everything else fade just slightly. It wasn't overwhelming. It was grounding. And then I made the smallest decision that carried the most weight. I didn't step back. That was it. No dramatic gesture. No obvious signal. Just the absence of resistance. But it was enough. Because the energy in the room shifted instantly. Not in a chaotic way, but in something more controlled, more certain. Like a silent agreement had just been confirmed. I could sense it in the way they looked at me now. No hesitation left, no need to test boundaries anymore. Whatever uncertainty had been there before was gone. And I had removed it. For a brief moment, I thought about my husband again. Not because he had done anything to interrupt this, but because he hadn't. He was still there, still part of the same space, and yet completely disconnected from what was unfolding just beneath the surface. That absence hit differently now. It didn't feel like something I was waiting to fix. It felt like something I had already moved past. And that realization came with a sharp clarity that cut through everything else. This wasn't really about them. It never had been. They were just the reflection, the reaction to something that had been missing for a long time. Attention. Presence. A sense of being wanted, not out of obligation but out of genuine focus. And now that I was standing in it, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit before. I had been waiting for this feeling. Not this exact situation, not this exact moment, but this shift inside me. This awareness that I wasn't as invisible as I had started to believe. But awareness comes with a cost. Because the second you see yourself differently, you can't go back to who you were before. I felt it then, that subtle break. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just final. Something in me had changed, And I knew it wasn't temporary. The moment itself didn't need to go any further to make that clear. It wasn't about how far things would go physically. It was about how far they had already gone inside me, and that distance, it was enough because standing there, fully aware of what I had allowed, what I had accepted without saying a word, I realized something that settled deeper than any immediate consequence, that I wasn't confused anymore, that I wasn't hesitating, that I had made a choice, even if it didn't look like one from the outside, and now, there was no way to pretend I hadn't, because some lines, once crossed in your mind, don't need anything else to become real. The room didn't explode into chaos after that. There was no dramatic confrontation, no sudden realization that forced everything into the open. Instead, it ended quietly, so quietly that, on the surface, it almost felt like nothing had happened at all. But everything had. That was the unsettling part. Conversations eventually picked back up, though they lacked the same careless tone from before. The laughter felt measured now, like everyone was aware of something they couldn't openly acknowledge. Movements became slightly more distant, more controlled. It was subtle, but it was there. And I felt it in myself most of all. That I moved through the rest of the night like I always did, calm, composed, saying the right things at the right time. No one looking from the outside would have noticed anything unusual. But inside, there was a quiet shift that refused to settle back into place, that I didn't look at my husband the same way. Not out of anger. Not even disappointment, at least not in the way I had expected. It was something colder than that. Clearer. Like I had finally stopped expecting something from him that he had no intention of giving. He hadn't asked a single question, not during, not after, not even when we were finally alone. He spoke about ordinary things, as if the night had followed its usual pattern, as if nothing worth noticing had happened right in front of him. And I listened, responding where necessary, but there was a distance between us now that felt impossible to ignore. It wasn't created in that moment. It had been there for a long time. I had just stopped pretending otherwise. The following days were even stranger. Not because of what people said, but because of what they didn't. His friends didn't bring anything up directly. There were no repeated jokes, no obvious attempts to revisit what had happened, but their behavior had changed. There was a restraint now, a carefulness that hadn't existed before. They didn't test boundaries again, not in the same way. It was as if they already had their answer and that was enough. And somehow that made everything feel more real, because the absence of pressure didn't erase the fact that something had been allowed. If anything, it confirmed it. The moment didn't need to be repeated to exist. It had already settled into place. I found myself replaying it less, not because it didn't matter anymore, but because I understood it now. It hadn't been about them wanting to watch. It hadn't even been about the situation itself. It had been about me realizing something I had been avoiding for a long time. I had been waiting to feel wanted in my own marriage. Waiting for attention that never came. Waiting for effort that slowly disappeared. Waiting for something to shift without ever forcing it to. And in that one moment, when someone else's attention replaced that absence, I didn't reject it. That was the truth I couldn't escape. Not that I had done something obvious or undeniable, but that I hadn't needed to. The line had already moved and I had let it. What surprised me most wasn't the guilt. It came and went, but it didn't take over the way I thought it would. Instead, what stayed was a kind of awareness I hadn't had before. I could see my marriage clearly now. Not through hope, not through habit, but as it actually was. Quiet, distant, unbalanced. And for the first time, I stopped trying to fix it in my head. A few days later, something happened that made everything settle into place in a way I hadn't expected. My husband made an offhand comment, casual, almost careless. He mentioned how his friends tend to notice things, followed by a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was quick, easy to miss. But I didn't miss it. In that moment, everything aligned in a way that felt almost too precise. He had noticed. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every look, but enough. Enough to understand what had been happening, and enough to choose not to interrupt it. I didn't react immediately. I just looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find something in his expression that would explain it. Anger, discomfort, even curiosity, but there was nothing clear there, just distance. The same distance that had been there long before that night, and suddenly, the question wasn't why he didn't stop. It was why I had stayed in something that made moments like that possible in the first place. That realization didn't come with a dramatic decision. I didn't confront him right away. I didn't turn the situation into something louder than it already was. Because the truth didn't need volume. It was already clear. What happened that night didn't break my marriage. It revealed it. And once you see something for what it really is, you don't get to unsee it. I still think about that moment sometimes, not for what almost happened, but for what it showed me about myself. About how easy it is to drift into something you once would have rejected, not because you changed suddenly, but because something in your life slowly made it feel less wronged. That's the part no one talks about. The quiet shifts. The small allowances. The moments where you don't say no, not because you're sure, but because you're not. And in the end, that's what stayed with me. Not them. Not even him, just the understanding that the most important line I crossed was the one inside myself.